She's probably in the wrong place. Check her ID again. Do we flag this? The whispers weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Not said to her, but about her. Spoken in the corners of the room, passed through glances, woven into pauses. They traveled like static, vibrating through marble floors and behind sleek glass. A black woman stood at the center of it all, unaware, or at least pretending to be. But she noticed. Of course she did. Eliza Monroe always noticed. It was just before noon at Skywell Bank's flagship branch downtown. Quiet, polished, and full of small, practiced performances. The kind of place where power was implied through minimalism. Every detail, from the soft gold fixtures to the hushed leather chairs, whispered exclusivity. Everything about it was designed to say, "You're lucky to be here." But when Eliza walked through those glass doors, the silence that greeted her wasn't about reverence. It was about resistance. The welcome desk employee looked up and did nothing. No smile. No greeting. His hand hovered near the intercom, not for assistance, but surveillance. His colleague leaned in. There were no words exchanged aloud, but the shared glance said it all. Watch her. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke a word, reduced to a stereotype just by walking through a door? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button, share this story, and remember, corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. As if her presence alone was suspicious. As if the curve of her jaw, the hue of her skin, the quiet confidence in her stride were somehow offensive to the decor. Security stiffened near the entrance. Not hostile, not obvious, just ready. That strange kind of readiness that follows black bodies into boardrooms, boutique hotels, and bank branches alike. Not a stance of service, but of suspicion. Eliza didn't flinch. She walked as she always did, upright, graceful, present without seeking permission. Her beige trench coat fell perfectly against her frame, her dress immaculate, her expression serene. Her natural curls were pulled back in a low bun, earrings small, her heels deliberate but soft. She had the kind of calm that unnerved people who rely on discomfort to feel superior. She stood at the teller line for longer than necessary, watching the woman behind the counter pretend to finish typing something she clearly wasn't focused on. The delay wasn't procedural. It was personal, measured, strategic. Eventually, the teller looked up. Cold, flat, not a hello, just a tired pause. Eliza made her request. She wanted to withdraw a significant amount from a corporate account. Not an emergency, not strange, not unusual unless you didn't think someone like her should be able to access that much money in the first place. The teller blinked, froze, asked her to wait. Minutes later, the branch manager emerged. Stiff, unsmiling, not curious, but calculated. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask how he could help. He looked at Eliza like she was a riddle he didn't trust. He asked for her ID, then a second piece, then confirmation of the account type, then the nature of the transaction. His tone wasn't inquisitive. It was accusatory dressed in formality, like her answers had already been deemed incorrect before they were spoken. Eliza complied, without raising her voice, without flinching. Her documents were pristine, her account access secure. She even opened the corporate banking app and gestured toward her own name on the screen. But it wasn't enough, because this wasn't about the information. This was about the invisibility of authority when it doesn't wear the right skin. The manager said the withdrawal seemed unusual, that it required a heightened review, that internal protocols suggested the request might be fraudulent. Eliza knew the terms. She had helped write them. At her desk at Skywell HQ, those same compliance rules were printed in a binder she'd reviewed just weeks earlier. But in that branch, her authority wasn't recognized. Not because it didn't exist, but because they chose not to see it. To them, she was just another customer asking for too much. They didn't know that while they debated the validity of her identity, the woman they were profiling was the one tasked with leading the company into the next fiscal quarter. She was technically their boss. But that's not what made this moment dangerous. What made it powerful was that Eliza didn't tell them. She didn't reveal who she was, didn't flash a title, didn't mention her seat on the board or her role in the recent merger. She just stood there, calm, patient, letting the system do exactly what it had been programmed to do. Because when you want to expose a machine, sometimes the best strategy is to let it run. Uninterrupted, Eliza was eventually escorted into a private side room for further verification. It wasn't policy. It was containment, a space for people the staff didn't trust, but couldn't legally remove. Inside, the silence deepened. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, a small leather handbag at her side. She didn't make a phone call, didn't demand to speak to legal. She simply waited until her phone buzzed quietly. A message from her executive assistant at headquarters. "We're watching the feed. Do you want us to intervene?" Eliza read it, slid the phone back into her bag. No reply. She wasn't ready to stop it. Not yet, because the truth wasn't fully visible. Not until they showed their full hand. And they were only halfway there. To understand how this moment would ripple through corporate corridors, disrupt internal systems, and eventually make headlines across the country, you have to know who Eliza Monroe really was. She didn't come from privilege. She came from legacy, built through sweat and sacrifice. A daughter of educators and nurses. A granddaughter of activists and pastors. Her name didn't open doors. Her intellect kicked them open. She rose through finance not by mimicry, but mastery. She was fluent in balance sheets, in boardroom dynamics, in building value where others saw risk. She didn't shout her worth. She proved it quarter after quarter, deal after deal. She became the youngest black female CFO in her firm's history. And when Skywell merged with her company just months ago, she was named interim CEO, the first woman of color to hold that role in the institution's century-long existence. But she didn't announce it. She went to work. She believed change was louder in action than in applause. So when she walked into that branch, her branch, she wasn't expecting fanfare. But she didn't expect erasure either. And yet, that's what she got. 10 minutes. That's all it took for assumption to harden into insult. Eliza hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. She let them make the mistake on their own. And now they were doubling down. She was quietly escorted into a private consultation room. Cold, controlled, unnecessary. The kind of room they reserved not for clients but for containment. Eliza Monroe sat in the private consultation room, if that's what it could even be called. It was cold. Not physically but atmospherically. A small square table. A fake plant in the corner. 2 mismatched chairs that suggested formality without comfort. The kind of space that silently declared, "You're not a priority." Moments earlier, she had been standing at the main counter. She had asked, clearly and calmly, to withdraw funds from one of her business accounts. But somewhere between the word withdraw and the amount, the mood shifted like a gust of wind slamming an open window shut. First came the questioning. Not the standard kind. Not the just doing our job kind. No, this was the type soaked in thinly veiled suspicion. The teller's voice had been saccharine sweet but dripping with doubt. The way she furrowed her brow at the account details. The way she said Eliza's name, as though tasting it for the first time and finding it hard to swallow. Then came the protocol. The word unusual started to get tossed around. As in, this seems like an unusual request. This level of access is unusual. But there was nothing unusual about it. Not for someone with her position, not for someone with her portfolio. What was unusual was their discomfort. The manager returned. His name tag read D. Callahan. Though he never offered it aloud. A man in his early 50s, thin-lipped, always adjusting his sleeves as if to maintain control of something he didn't fully possess. He introduced himself with a tone that wasn't interested in being polite, just procedural. He reviewed the same documents she had already provided. Driver's license, company identification, corporate access badge, digital banking credentials. Everything matched. Still, he insisted something didn't sit right. He asked her what the money was for. She reminded him, without raising her voice, that her financial activity was not subject to explanation unless flagged by compliance or law. that only seemed to aggravate him further. To him, her calmness read as arrogance. Her precision sounded like defiance. He didn't see a professional, he saw a challenge. And challenges needed to be shut down. The decision was made quickly and unceremoniously. The transaction would not be processed today. He told her it was for her safety, that he needed to protect the institution, that large cash withdrawals required a higher level of scrutiny when they seemed out of place. He didn't need to say it. The implication screamed louder than any slur could have. Out of place. She didn't fit the image they had in mind for someone who should be moving that amount of money. Not in that skin. Not in that dress. Not with that grace. At another point in her life, Eliza might have argued, might have snapped back, demanded escalation, called legal. But years in boardrooms had taught her something more powerful than retaliation. Endurance. She asked instead to be shown into a private room, a request that shocked the manager, as if he expected her to break down in the lobby, to cause a scene that would validate his suspicions. He didn't expect composure. He didn't expect elegance under fire. They granted the room, but not as a courtesy, as a containment measure. Let her anger out in here, not out there. What they didn't know was, Eliza's power was never in her anger. It was in her patience. In that room, she waited. Her fingers gently traced the edge of her phone, but she didn't unlock it. She didn't need to. Her assistant already knew the situation. Corporate security was watching remotely. Legal counsel had been notified automatically the moment she pinged her authentication ID at the teller station. An internal system built into her executive clearance. Yes, she had tools. Yes, she had power. But still, sitting in that chair, in that room, being treated like a criminal for trying to move her own money. It stung. Because it reminded her that no title, no degree, no portfolio insulated her from what too many like her experienced every day. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about the denial of dignity. And that denial? It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered in policy. It grinned through customer service masks. It hid behind institutional language. That's how modern discrimination works. It cloaks itself in procedure. Back outside, the manager paced behind the teller line, whispering into the phone with someone at Central. He was clearly unsettled. Not because he believed he'd done anything wrong, but because his instincts had been challenged, and instincts don't like being questioned. He still believed he was right, that something about this customer didn't sit right, that he'd done the prudent thing. And yet, something was shifting in the background. A supervisor from upstairs had quietly entered the branch. His presence wasn't announced. He observed from the corner, near the client services desk. His phone was out, eyes scrolling, jaw tightening. He had received a corporate memo minutes earlier. Something about a security flag. Something about a code-level escalation from Executive HQ. The kind that only triggers if a board-level executive is flagged or mistreated during a transaction. The man looked up from his phone, then looked toward the private room, then back at the manager. Suddenly, things weren't adding up. The room had become colder. Back inside, Eliza stared at the reflection of herself in the mirror across the glass wall. She looked as she always did, refined, confident, poised. But behind the calm, there was a storm, not of rage, but of resolve. Because she knew this moment, this insult, wasn't just hers. It belonged to every black woman who had ever been told to sit down when she had the right to stand. Every person whose credentials were questioned because of how they looked before they were even allowed to speak. And to the countless others who didn't have a seat at the executive table to rewrite what happens next. Eliza Monroe was not just going to walk away from this. She was going to let it unfold. Let it document itself. Let it reveal the very rot that had been hiding behind glossy branding, smiling ads, and diversity and inclusion taglines in corporate annual reports. Because sometimes the most radical thing a person of power can do is not intervene. Not yet. Let the machine expose itself. And in just a few more minutes it would. With no warning, and no room left for denial. Behind the heavy frosted glass of the consultation room, time felt still. Eliza Monroe sat with her hands neatly folded on the small table. No tapping fingers, no shifting in her chair, no visible signs of agitation. To the casual observer, she appeared indifferent. But that wasn't stillness. It was calculation. Every minute that passed was part of a system she knew better than anyone in that building. Not because she had read the manuals, but because she had helped rewrite them. Eliza had been the architect behind the very compliance protocol now being weaponized against her. The silence wasn't passive. It was loaded, because somewhere in that branch the cracks were beginning to form. Upstairs, in a tucked-away executive lounge meant for regional directors and VIP clients, a man in a navy suit scrolled anxiously through a secured email on his company-issued tablet. Jeremiah Kessler, Director of Risk Operations, had only just returned from a 2-day board summit. His day had started with lattes and performance charts. He hadn't expected an executive security flag to hit his inbox before noon. But there it was. Level 3 breach alert. Tagged to an internal ID he didn't recognize at first, until he cross-referenced it against the transition database. And that's when the color drained from his face. Eliza A. Monroe, Interim CEO, Executive Chair, Skywell Financial Holdings. Not a client, not a regional manager, the CEO. And right now, she was sitting in a branch under his region's jurisdiction, without service, without respect, without anyone having the faintest idea who they were speaking to. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, Manager Callahan continued pacing, his mouth close to the receiver as he rambled into the phone with compliance. To him, this was still salvageable. Just a small incident. A hiccup. He didn't know his phone calls were now being monitored. He didn't know that the voice on the other end, compliance, had already stopped listening. They were focused on the higher authority that had just stepped in. Eliza hadn't said a word since being escorted into the side room. She didn't need to. The dominoes had been tipped. And like all fragile systems, they fell fast. At Skywell's headquarters, on the 27th floor of a mirrored skyscraper, 3 screens lit up with live security footage of the downtown branch. A young analyst, barely out of grad school, sat frozen in front of the feed, eyes darting between windows. One camera showed Eliza alone in the side room, still calm, still composed. Another camera showed Callahan muttering behind the counter. The third showed the lobby. What the analyst couldn't see, but would soon learn, is that the footage wasn't just being recorded. It was being forwarded to the General Counsel, to the head of Ethics and Integrity, to the Board Oversight Committee, and to the private inboxes of 3 investors who had pushed hard for Eliza's placement during the merger. This wasn't just a customer service failure. This was a leadership optics disaster in slow motion. Back at the branch, Kessler moved quickly and quietly. He approached the reception desk and flashed his ID. No need for introductions. Staff recognized him immediately. The receptionist fumbled a greeting, but he brushed past without slowing. His steps were sharp, intentional. He made eye contact with Callahan across the room. Callahan's expression flickered. Confusion, hesitation, then something else. Fear. The director didn't call him over, didn't shout. He simply pointed toward the private consultation room and raised an eyebrow. Callahan blinked, then walked. Every step toward that door felt like it weighed more than the last. Inside the room, Eliza didn't rise. She looked up once, made brief eye contact, then returned her gaze to the table. That was all. But that gaze, so brief, so clinical, cut deeper than any words. Because now he knew. He didn't know how. He didn't know what had shifted. But suddenly, the air was different. His chest tightened. The woman he had suspected of fraud just minutes ago was someone powerful enough to call him into this room without ever opening her mouth. She didn't need to yell. She didn't even need to stand. Her silence had authority, and that terrified him more than anything. Kessler stood outside, watching. He didn't interrupt. He wanted Callahan to sit in the weight of it, to feel the gravity of what had happened before they intervened. Because this wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about accountability. And the entire institution had just been caught exposing its deepest flaw. It didn't recognize leadership unless it looked a certain way, unless it felt familiar. unless it spoke with the same voice, dressed in the same style, carried the same privilege. Eliza didn't match their pattern, and so they erased her until it was too late. The branch's lobby had grown quieter. Staff whispered behind partitions. Clients watched the movement, sensing tension but not knowing its source. But whispers were already spreading. A woman on her phone near the ATM had recorded the earlier confrontation. Just the edge of it. She didn't know who Eliza was, but something had felt off. She uploaded it to a private social account with a caption. "Why does it feel like they're trying to block this woman from her own money?" It wouldn't go viral yet, but it would. And when it did, the footage wouldn't be of someone shouting or demanding. It would be of someone sitting still, waiting, knowing her moment was coming. Callahan finally spoke. But his voice was different now. Softer, uneven. Gone was the clipped tone of authority. In its place, uncertainty. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. That he was only following protocol. Eliza didn't respond. She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't offer rage. She simply nodded once. And then, finally, she stood. It was that simple gesture, standing, that broke the illusion. Because now everyone could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. No title had been announced. No name had been declared. But every person in that building understood something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The system had just profiled its own CEO. And the CEO had let it. Just long enough for everyone to see it in the mirror. Eliza Monroe stepped out of the private room without a word. But her presence thundered louder than any corporate announcement. Everything shifted the moment she crossed that threshold. The air inside the branch felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had suddenly realized what they'd just allowed to happen. The subtle hum of computers and printers faded beneath the weight of stares. Customers paused mid-transaction. Staff froze in postures of half-finished movements. Even the security guard, previously so alert and ready, looked suddenly unsure of what exactly he was guarding against. Eliza didn't need to say who she was. By now, enough people knew, and those who didn't could feel it in their bones. Her walk was steady, not rushed, not performative. It was the gait of someone who knew every step forward made the world behind her collapse. Gracefully and without fuss. At the counter, Manager Callahan looked up and locked eyes with her once more. His breath hitched, just briefly. That look, so calm, so composed, shattered the last thread of confidence he had been holding on to. The performance was over, and the reckoning had begun. In the background, Jeremiah Kessler, Director of Risk Operations, was already making phone calls, not the kind that ask for permission but the kind that issue instructions. He wasn't contacting marketing or public relations. Not yet. No, this was an internal firestorm that needed to be contained before it ignited everything else. Compliance officers had been looped in. Security logs were being pulled. The legal department had just issued a request for a full transcript of every interaction that occurred within the last 30 minutes, including recordings, surveillance footage, and access logs. The building's heartbeat had shifted, and all because one woman had walked in, asked for her own money, and been refused on the basis of what? Not policy, not procedure, perception. And perception, in this case, had been poisoned by generations of coded thinking, unconscious bias, and structural blindness. The kind of blindness that assumes authority wears a certain face. And when it doesn't, it must be fraud. Back at the front of the branch, the teller who had initially served Eliza now looked visibly shaken. She was staring at the floor, trying to minimize her presence, as though shrinking might erase her earlier condescension. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the stack of brochures beside her desk, an idle task to distract from the knowledge that she had participated in something deeply wrong. She had heard enough in the last few minutes to understand the gravity. She had witnessed the sudden deference of her manager, the silent, sharp movements of upper leadership, the shift in posture from power to panic. And yet it hadn't taken a news article, a scandal, or a protest to trigger it. It had only taken Eliza's silence. The security guard near the entrance received a message on his earpiece. A voice telling him to stand down, remain neutral, and make no further movements unless instructed by corporate security. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped back. Because when institutions begin to turn inward, when they recognize that they've just exposed their own failure, it doesn't take long for the command chain to freeze in place. Everyone waits. Everyone watches. And nobody wants to make it worse. In the regional operations center a few blocks away, a cluster of high-level executives had gathered around a boardroom table. None of them had spoken yet. They didn't need to. The email chain said enough. It was only 3 words long. She let it happen. That was all it took to send the entire branch of Skywell Bank into a tailspin. Because Eliza Monroe wasn't just their CEO. She was a mirror. And now they had to decide what to do with their reflection. Inside the branch, Kessler finally approached Eliza directly. He didn't greet her with a handshake. He didn't lead with small talk. He simply offered a respectful nod. A gesture loaded with apology, acknowledgement, and a deep awareness that no words would be enough. Eliza nodded back, just once. Still, she said nothing. Because anything said now would only soften the truth. And she wanted the truth to remain sharp. Manager Callahan stood at the far end of the room, his back stiff, trying to look busy but utterly failing. His hands flicked at papers that didn't need sorting. His eyes darted toward Eliza, then away. He could feel the walls closing in. He knew something irreversible had happened. Not just to his reputation, not just to his role, but to the mythology he had built around himself, that if he followed the rules, trusted his instincts, and treated unusual activity with suspicion, he was doing the right thing. But that mythology had just collapsed under the weight of a woman who, by all traditional standards, had done everything right, and was still treated like a trespasser in her own domain. And now, he was the one being watched. The shame wasn't in being caught. The shame was in realizing he hadn't even paused to question himself before he acted. Outside the building, a car pulled up. A sleek black town car with no markings. Only tinted windows and a driver who stepped out in a crisp gray suit. The driver didn't say who he was picking up. He didn't need to. Eliza saw the car, turned, and began walking toward it. No fanfare, no media, no dramatic exit. Just another quiet moment in a day that had shaken an entire institution to its core. As the door opened and she stepped inside, every person who had underestimated her watched from behind glass. Not because they were told to, but because they couldn't look away. They had witnessed something they weren't prepared for. Not rage, not vengeance, just power, refined, composed, undeniable. And in that silence, in that poise, in that unwavering sense of self, Eliza had said everything. Inside the boardroom, the senior leadership team reviewed the live footage again. Frame by frame, watching how it had all unfolded. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others rubbed their temples in disbelief. But one thing was certain. This wasn't an isolated event. This was a lesson. And it would ripple through policy, training, and culture like an aftershock. Because sometimes, it takes a quiet walkout to cause the loudest fallout. And this one had only just begun. For manager Dean Callahan, the longest walk of his professional life wasn't across a stage or through a boardroom door. It was the 20 feet from the teller desk to the HR office upstairs. He wasn't summoned by name. There was no intercom call, no aggressive order. Just a glance from Kessler, sharp, brief, commanding, and the weight of it landed like a stone on his chest. It was the kind of look that required no words because it told you everything. You're no longer in control. And the room knows it. The elevator ride up was silent. No eye contact. Just the artificial ding of floors passing like seconds counting down to something irreversible. By the time the doors opened, the hallway felt like a tunnel, each step echoing with the memory of the choices he had made just 30 minutes earlier. At the end of that hallway, a modest office with frosted glass waited. Inside sat 2 figures he had never expected to face under these circumstances. One from internal compliance, the other from corporate ethics. They didn't offer coffee. There was no fake laughter, no small talk to soften the fall. Just a seat, and a folder, thick, labeled. He sat, but not comfortably. His body instinctively tensed, preparing for a fight his mind already knew he'd lost. The first pages reviewed the events that had taken place downstairs. The customer interaction, the identity verification, the escalated refusal. But beneath the legal phrasing was something deeper, an indictment not of his actions, but of his assumptions. Because this wasn't just about denying service. It was about who he had denied. And why? Eliza hadn't returned. She didn't need to. Her absence was now a presence. Every hallway whisper carried her name. Every shared glance among the staff came laced with the knowledge that the power structure had inverted, and no one had seen it coming until it was already too late. But the real reckoning wasn't in policy violations or compliance failures. It was in the mirror Callahan was now being forced to look into. The documents in front of him detailed his words. Not transcribed from memory, but pulled directly from security audio, time-stamped and matched to facial recognition footage. There it was. His voice. Flat. Suspicious. Dismissive. Asking questions no white male executive would ever be asked when withdrawing their own funds. Refusing documentation that would have been accepted from any other hand. Treating legitimacy as anomaly, authority as theft, and worst of all, believing it was professionalism. That's what cut deepest. Because Dean Callahan didn't see himself as racist. He'd never raised his voice. He'd never used a slur. He'd never slammed a door or thrown out an accusation. He believed in rules, in caution, in safety. But it was that exact belief, that blind confidence in his own neutrality, that had allowed him to humiliate a black woman who outranked every executive he'd ever met without hesitation. And now, as the footage played on the office screen beside him, showing Eliza's stillness, her composure, her impossible patience, he felt the shame rise in his throat like a sickness, because she had given him every opportunity to course correct, and he had chosen every step of the way to double down, not out of malice, but out of the most dangerous illusion in modern leadership, that good intentions shield you from consequences. Elsewhere, in Skywell's global offices, a memo had been drafted. Its tone was urgent but calculated. An internal incident report had begun circulating, authored by the Office of Corporate Ethics. But what was striking wasn't the language. It was the reaction. Within minutes, division heads began quietly forwarding the report to their teams. Not as a threat, but as a warning. Screenshots made their way onto internal Slack channels. Group chats buzzed with disbelief. The footage was still classified, but the story had already escaped the walls of the institution. Whispers turned to headlines. Black CEO profiled by her own branch systems under review. The irony was poetic. The same bank that had plastered itself across social media during Black History Month, that had launched campaigns promoting inclusive leadership, had now become the latest symbol of how surface-level inclusion collapses under unchallenged bias. Back in the HR office, Callahan was asked to write a statement. Not a confession, not an apology, just an acknowledgement of the incident and its procedural consequences. But every sentence he tried to form crumbled under the weight of the moment. What do you say when your entire worldview is punctured by the realization that you weren't the gatekeeper? Just a symptom. He scribbled something short. It wasn't enough. He knew it. The ethics officer collected it quietly, thanked him, and stood. It was over. His position wasn't terminated yet, but he had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending review, which, in corporate language, was just the long shadow of a short future. Later that evening, after the building had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Callahan returned to his desk one last time to collect his things. The branch was quiet now. Too quiet. The same staff who once greeted him with casual smiles now avoided eye contact. Not because they hated him, but because they'd seen something unseeable. And none of them wanted to acknowledge how close they'd come to doing the same. At his desk, he found a folded note. It wasn't signed. It read, "She gave you every chance to treat her like a person. You chose to treat her like a problem." He didn't know who had written it, but it didn't matter, because they were right. And no disciplinary report, no HR policy update, no corporate training module would ever erase what had just happened. He had failed not just a customer. He had failed a leader, a symbol. A woman who carried centuries of quiet fortitude into a room designed to silence her, and still chose grace. As he walked out for the last time, the door closed behind him with a finality no meeting could reverse. And somewhere, in a room far removed from that branch, Eliza Monroe sat reviewing a report of the incident. Her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was resolute, because this had never been about one manager or one mistake. It was about a system, and now, that system had seen itself, fully, clearly, and it would never be able to pretend again. By the following morning, the story had left the walls of Skywell Bank and begun its quiet, blistering climb into the public sphere. It didn't begin with a press release. There were no leaks from the top. No grand exposé. Just a grainy, 14-second phone recording posted by a woman who'd been standing in the ATM line at the time of the incident. She hadn't known who the woman in the beige trench coat was, only that something felt wrong. The video showed no shouting, no violence, just the frozen image of a black woman standing patiently while a manager, jaw tight with suspicion, turned his back and spoke rapidly into a phone. The caption beneath the clip read, "They treated her like a criminal. Look how calm she stayed." That was all. And yet, the internet didn't need more. It did what it always does with truth. It ran faster than denial could catch up. Within 3 hours, the video had crossed 500,000 views. By lunchtime, it was trending. Then came the real shock. A former Skywell employee replied to the thread, casually adding, "That's not just any woman. That's Eliza Monroe. She's the CEO now." The algorithm snapped its head up. Wait, what? The internet leaned in closer. Screenshots followed. Corporate directories. LinkedIn confirmations. Press announcements from the merger weeks earlier that most people had skimmed past. All of it now dug up and dissected with forensic precision. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about racial profiling. It was about irony, about failure, about a company that had built an entire brand around modern leadership and diversity pipelines being caught denying its own CEO access to her funds in public view. News outlets were slower to catch on, but not by much. By that evening, 2 national networks had already picked up the clip. The headlines were restrained, almost clinical at first. Skywell CEO mistaken for fraud suspect by bank staff. Corporate oversight? CEO profiled at own institution. But the comment sections beneath those stories said what the headlines wouldn't. They didn't see her, even when she was everything they say they support. She's the boss, and they still treated her like a threat. The quiet dignity of Eliza's response, no outburst, no threat, no declaration, had become the center of gravity. People weren't just reacting to her identity. They were reacting to her restraint. It shook people, because it forced a question. If this is how they treat someone like her, what happens to everyone else? Within 48 hours, Skywell's board issued a statement. It was corporate in tone, legal in language, acknowledgement without admission, regret without apology. But behind the scenes, something more real was unraveling. Eliza hadn't demanded firings. She hadn't sent legal teams to break down doors. What she'd done instead was more dangerous to a system built on optics. She had started an audit, not of the bank's finances, but of its behavior. She had called for every regional manager to submit a log of compliance reviews related to account access disputes over the last 12 months. She demanded anonymized transcripts of flagged customers whose identities had been challenged without cause. She pushed for a full demographic breakdown of suspicious activity reports, and the numbers were exactly what she feared: disproportionate, targeted, and most damning of all, unchallenged. At a closed-door leadership summit the following week, Eliza took the stage. There were no cameras, no press, just department heads, board members, and regional executives who had spent the last week watching the company's public image smolder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't recount the events of the branch incident. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked a single question that hung in the air like smoke. "What is it about me that made you not see me?" And then, silence. Not a forced silence. A real one. The kind that makes people look at each other and realize they don't have an answer. Because the answer wasn't in her ID. It wasn't in the paperwork. It wasn't in the balance sheet. It was in the wiring of an industry that still equated authority with familiarity, and familiarity all too often with whiteness, with maleness, with voices that sound a certain way and bodies that move through space without being doubted. In the weeks that followed, Skywell changed. Not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. Mandatory bias training was no longer outsourced, it was redesigned from within. Executives didn't just sign compliance forms. They were required to complete immersion programs led by external social justice educators with the power to veto promotions. A new policy was implemented. Any client denied access to funds without legal cause triggered a red flag report that went straight to a central ethics board for review. But perhaps the most transformative change came quietly. Eliza launched an internal initiative called the Dignity Ledger, an anonymous platform where staff at any level could document moments of subtle exclusion, procedural profiling, or internal bias. Not as accusations, but as data, because you can't fix what you don't measure. And Skywell was now measuring everything. As for the public, they hadn't forgotten. Social media continued to resurface the clip on every new anniversary of the merger. Not because the moment was viral, but because it was vital. It served as a case study, as a teaching tool, as a mirror. Universities included it in business ethics courses. HR departments used it as a training module. Activists cited it when calling for regulatory reforms in financial oversight. And through it all, Eliza remained composed. She didn't seek interviews. She didn't become a spokesperson. She became something far more difficult to ignore. A precedent. A living example of what happens when grace meets discrimination and refuses to perform pain for the comfort of others. In private, she continued her work, investing in local communities, funding financial literacy programs in neighborhoods the banking world had historically abandoned, creating leadership fellowships for young women of color who had been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't look the part. She never said the manager's name in public. She didn't need to, because the point was never to punish one man. The point was to wake up an entire structure. And now it was awake, not healed, not absolved, but seen, clearly. For the first time in a long time, time passed as it always does, not in loud announcements, but in the steady tick of change folding into everyday life. The story of Eliza Monroe and the bank that failed to recognize her became something different over time. It was no longer just about a moment, no longer just a headline. It became a lesson, passed along in classrooms, boardrooms, community halls, and quiet conversations between people trying to understand what fairness really means. For many, Eliza's name was first discovered through a single clip online. A woman standing calmly at a bank counter, treated with suspicion. A manager speaking into a phone, face tight with distrust. The viral framing drew people in, but the deeper truth stayed with them far longer. It was the stillness that made it unforgettable. Because in a world that expects black women to perform either excellence or anger for their legitimacy, Eliza had done neither. She had simply waited. And in that waiting, the entire institution had exposed itself. Years later, Skywell Financial looked very different. The lobby no longer displayed generic stock photos of handshakes and spreadsheets. Instead, it showcased portraits of its real team, diverse, local, human. The kind of faces you wouldn't have seen in a bank ad a decade ago. Faces that now led departments, taught onboarding sessions, built policy from lived experience, not detached theory. The internal culture had been restructured not just through training, but through transparency. Metrics were publicly reported. Promotions were reviewed through equity audits. A new department called Bias Response and Reform sat 2 floors below the executive suite, not buried in HR. It wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And that change had a name behind it, whether spoken aloud or not. Eliza never returned to that branch. She didn't need to. Her influence lived in the systems now. In the unglamorous details, policy documents, feedback loops, case reviews, field reports. Her fingerprints were on everything. not as a stamp of ownership, but as a quiet commitment to accountability. She had never wanted to become a symbol, never asked to be the face of reform, but the world had chosen her story, and she had chosen what to do with the spotlight, not to bask in it, but to redirect it, to shine it on every other person who had been denied something as simple as trust. Outside of Skywell, her legacy had begun to bloom elsewhere. A nonprofit initiative she launched, the Quiet Power Fund, had started giving microgrants to young professionals of color in financial services, law, and public policy. No strings attached, just seed money, just belief. One of those recipients, a 26-year-old former intern, eventually went on to become the youngest VP of compliance in Skywell's history. She often credited her career to the day Ms. Monroe didn't raise her voice. Because in that refusal to react the way the world expected, Eliza had shown a generation of leaders something rare. You don't have to become loud to be heard. You don't have to fight with fire to be remembered. Sometimes, dignity disrupts more than fury ever could. Eliza herself retreated further from public life. She stepped down from her executive role a few years after the incident, not out of defeat, but out of choice. She had stayed long enough to reshape the foundation. She had left enough tools behind to keep it standing. She returned to community work, to writing, to mentorship. Her name continued to appear on panels, think tanks, university guest lectures. But she declined interviews about the branch incident every time. Not because it hurt, but because she never wanted the story to center on her humiliation. Only the systems that allowed it, and the possibilities created in its aftermath. One day, at a small business conference hosted in a converted warehouse in Atlanta, Eliza sat on the back row as a young black woman took the stage. She was there to talk about leadership. She opened her keynote with a story, not of a merger, not of policy reform, not even of finance, but of a moment where a woman was underestimated, profiled, and dismissed, and how that moment broke open an industry. She never said Eliza's name. She didn't need to. Eliza smiled quietly from the back, eyes full. Legacy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply echoes. In the years that followed, Eliza's story was adapted into podcasts, documentaries, and case studies. But the most meaningful retelling didn't come through the media. It came in a note she received one winter morning. The handwriting was awkward, youthful. It came from a high school student who had read about her during a school equity project. The final line read, "I didn't know we were allowed to be powerful like that." Eliza kept the note tucked into a book on her bedside table. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that change doesn't begin with noise. It begins with a moment of stillness, with a refusal to shrink, with a calm, unshakable belief in your own worth, even when the world refuses to see it. Especially then. If this story moved you, if you believe quiet courage can shake entire systems, then please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments below. Have you ever been judged before you spoke? Have you ever stayed silent, only to let the truth speak for you? Let's build a community where dignity isn't questioned and power doesn't have to shout to be respected. Because stories like Eliza's aren't rare. They're just rarely told. Until now.